Welcome to another DNA Concepts for Genealogy video. My name is Dave Vance. As you can probably tell by the number of videos that are dedicated to it, I'm more of a Y-DNA researcher, but I thought it was important to give at least a very quick overview of autosomal DNA so that people had a more rounded set of videos to be able to look at. So if you sat through my first video, my part 1 video for Y-DNA, I went through this chart for all the different types of DNA testing that are common out there. And for autosomal DNA, really it's given by everybody. All the major companies have a version of autosomal DNA testing. It's very popular. It is in fact the most popular type of DNA testing that's out there. It does reach back. This is my little graphic for how far back it goes. It does reach back from you normally around 5 to 9 generations is when the pieces of DNA start getting so small that they're indistinguishable from noise, as well as you actually start to lose DNA connections to some of your ancestors. Not all of your ancestors back in this time frame actually have DNA that has come down to you. And we'll talk about that in this video. My little model of the cell here shows that all of the 23 chromosomes that you have are tested. It covers all of them, the ones that are in the nucleus. And then it can follow all of your lines back. So there is work to do in order to separate out where your matches sit and who you're connected to on which lines. But both men and women can take this test. Unlike Y-DNA, it's available to either gender, and it follows all of your ancestral lines. So that's the general overview of autosomal DNA before we get started into the details. So, like every other autosomal DNA explanation out there, I'm going to start with meiosis. Now, this is the production of what are called gametes, the sperm and egg cells that will end up combining at conception in order to form a new human child. This is called meiosis. It's different from other cell replication, which is called mitosis, which is how your body generates new cells for itself. This is specifically involved in the cells that will combine for conception. So you start with an original cell, perhaps in yourself, and it's a mixture of the paternal and the maternal chromosomes that you got from your father and your mother. All 23 of your chromosomes are paired, and this is just an example of one of the chromosomes that we'll take through a couple of examples here. So when it's producing a gamete, the first thing that the cell does is it replicates its DNA. It splits the paternal and the maternal separately, and it will replicate them both. So now we have 2 copies of the same chromosome. Then there's a process called crossing over, which is where the strands exchange information, little pieces of the DNA break off and get attached to the other side. This ensures diversity in the children and helps to keep the species healthy. Then you've got 2 copies of this now. It will separate once and have 1 chromosome here in each of these, and then they will separate again and leave the strands in 4 separate cells. Now you'll notice you sometimes get the identical copy of a paternal or a maternal strand here, and sometimes you'll get the combination of either one. So any of the 4 of these can join to form a new child at conception along with the cell that was formed in the same process in the other parent. So this could be a sperm cell, it could be an egg cell, the process is the same. If I look at this from an ancestry standpoint, now it gets a little more complicated, and I have the colors represent the paternal and the maternal chromosomes that were passed down to these parents, these grandparents in this case, since that's the grandparent ancestry. Obviously, these are themselves a combination of the DNA that they got from their own ancestors, but we'll keep to this color scheme for now. It's complicated enough. So, as each of these children are born, and your parents are born, these chromosomes combine. Again, this is just a representation of 1 out of the 23 chromosomes. These combine and produce a strand from each of the parents that may be a mixture of the chromosomes which they had. So you get the father and the mother of this child and the father and the mother of this child. You'll notice that the grandparents here of these 2 are the same. And so the segments that you inherit, or that these two children have inherited, they match in certain places, not the exact same place on the chromosomes, but they match in the parent that they got them from. So if these two compared their DNA, they would have a large amount, both the orange and the blue, in fact, on that chromosome, and these would also be the same. They're full siblings, so it's not surprising that they've inherited very similar DNA. Now, if these two cousins then are born, you'll notice that they are in turn a combination of their own parents' DNA, and the strands start to get a little more complicated because as they've split up twice now, they've started sharing smaller and smaller pieces of these chromosomes. So this chromosome is a combination of this one from the father plus this one. This person actually didn't inherit any of the purple side of this parent, so this grandmother here gave her green side, that may be her father's side, it could be her mother's, that has been passed on to this child, but the purple has now vanished, and clearly within only 2 generations, this is a simplified diagram, but this is what happens over 5 to 9 generations. You start to lose pieces of DNA. On the other hand, you've got the cousin over here, where when you look at these 2 chromosomes, they share the same segment in the same place from this ancestor, in fact, from that parent of this ancestor even. That is called identical by descent. It means it was passed on by descent, so these 2 people inherited it from an ancestor. And although it's a small piece, you can find that and match that segment to the fact that you have these ancestors in common. If you have other ancestors, you can start to tell exactly where that segment came from and which ancestor gave it to them. Now, you also, as these get smaller and smaller, especially smaller segments, can also be identical by state or by chance, which means they didn't actually get passed on. The segments just start to look like each other through random chance. That can happen with very small segments. We're not going to get into segment matching here and the size of segments that you need to look at, but once you get down past a certain size, identifying what you actually got from a common descent versus what's done by random chance is very difficult. And just to note here that when we talk about segments, they're typically measured in what's called centimorgans, which is treated as a unit of length. It doesn't matter what it refers to, you can look it up, but that's the common measure for segments that we talk about in autosomal DNA. The end result of this whole process is something that we already mostly know. It's fairly common knowledge that we inherit about 50% of the DNA from each of our parents. So this is a chart that you'll find in a lot of books on autosomal DNA testing. It's passed around the internet quite a bit. It helps to give you an idea of how quickly the pieces of DNA break down and what you might share with different relatives. So your father and your mother each give you around 50% of their DNA. Your brother and sister, you actually share 50% of your parents' DNA with them, so they share 50% with you. As you start having children and they start having children, you share 50% with your own son and daughter, the same way as you did with your own parents. You share another quarter, or a quarter, with your grandson or granddaughter, since they're now 2 times removed, and they got 50% of their own parents. In the same way, you share 25% with a niece or nephew, and only 12.5% with a grandniece or nephew. Going back up the chart, you share 25% with a grandfather, 12.5% with a great-grandfather, 6.25% with a great-great-grandfather, and of course, going back in time, each time it's divided by 2. Over on this side, you share 25% with an aunt and uncle, 12.5% with a first cousin. Then when you go even farther, it's 3.25% with a second cousin. And it gets even progressively smaller. So these actually become useful percentages because if you find out you share, let's say, 10% of your DNA with someone and you don't know what your relationship with them is, you can look on these charts and say, okay, well, what range would I have to be? What relationship would I have to be for it to fall in that range? And because you don't inherit exactly 50%, these are not precise percentages, they're DNA. So it's not always exactly the same percentages, you get this kind of chart, which is another version of that same chart, but with actual percentages on it. This is collected information from a lot of different tests. If you start with the fact that each person has approximately 6,800 centimorgans in their total DNA, you get the fact that what you share with a parent is on average around 3487. It should be 3400 if it was exactly 50%. Turns out it's a little bit more than that on average, but it can be within a range of 3330 to 3720. So you can inherit just under 50% to well over 50% with your parent. That kind of percentage change ends up propagating all the way through. So here is where you really get value from saying, okay, I share, let's say it's 10% of my DNA with someone and I don't know what my relationship with them is. If I have 6,800 centimorgans total, that means I share 680 centimorgans with a person. That means they can't be any farther out than perhaps a first cousin once removed, since the range allows up to 850 and I share 680. It couldn't be a first cousin second removed, that's too small. It couldn't be out here at all. It could be a great aunt or an uncle. Now, obviously, the ages and the possible relationships will come into play here. You can figure out likely what ones they are and then see where the actual segments match up to you. So you could also have half siblings, half cousins, and so on. So there's a range of relationships here that you can figure out just from the amount of DNA that you share with someone, what your possible relationships are, and then hopefully with your combined genealogy information, be able to narrow that down even further. So that's one of the common pursuits of autosomal DNA, is identifying matches in the database, figuring out how much your total match is in shared DNA, and then figuring out the relationship. Very often, the companies that offer testing, like Ancestry.com and 23andMe and a lot of the others, will do a lot of that for you up front. They'll give you a prediction for how close the person is. They might be a first cousin, second cousin, third cousin, and so on. They'll give you a prediction. Bear in mind, those are usually pretty simple predictions. They'll predict someone as a third cousin when they may in fact be a half cousin, let's say, or something like that. And you have to do a little more research to figure out whether that connection is what they're predicting or whether it's something else that has the same kind of range of shared DNA. It's just a different relationship. I'll throw in a little personal story here. My daughter, we adopted my daughter from Guatemala around 14 years ago. And about probably 2 years ago, she came to me and said, Dad, I'm kind of interested in seeing if anyone matches me in these databases that you play with all the time. Would you put my DNA out there and see if anybody matches me? Well, my answer at the time was, not a lot of people from Guatemala get tested, but sure, I'll be glad to put you in. And we didn't know much about her birth family. We knew her birth mother's name and a little bit of where she came from. We knew nothing at all about her birth father. So we only had partial information. So we put her DNA out, and for 2 years there was nothing. She got a little bit discouraged because there was no information out there. She had kind of hoped to find someone that might match her. So it was only about a month or two ago that I got a note online that said, my daughter adopted from Guatemala matches this person at this amount of DNA. It says she's a full sister. How is that possible? Well, it turns out she matched my daughter at 2,700 centimorgans, which if you look on this chart, is a full sibling. In fact, it can't be anything other than a full sibling if you look at it. It could be a parent. No, it actually can't even be a parent. But it's within the range of a full sibling, and it could hardly be anything else. So we found a sister to my adopted daughter, a biological sister, who has the same birth father and mother. Turns out she was born 2 years before my daughter was put up for adoption as well. We had never known about her. She was out searching for whether or not she had any biological siblings or relatives in the system, and it turns out they found each other. Now, they had information on both the birth father and the birth mother, so we now know more about my daughter's ancestry, and she has a biological sister that she's constantly on the phone with now. So anyway, it was a nice story about her finding an unknown biological relative through this process, and how the DNA, the shared DNA, was unequivocal as to what their relationship was going to be. If I look at the match reports, this is the kind of match report that we got, in fact, for my daughter. It says she shares 2,700 centimorgans with this person, so that's obviously a full sister. She has a possible first or second cousin in the system that shares the amount of DNA that's necessary for either of those relationships. Again, it could be a half cousin, it could be lots of other relationships where it's possible for that amount of shared DNA to make the relationship true as well. Then you start getting smaller and smaller pieces that start going out into potential second and third cousins, etc. Most of the databases will stop reporting around the fourth or fifth cousin level. The pieces get too small for that. Here's another kind of report. You'll get the shared centimorgans as well. There's difference between the longest block versus the amount of shared. That's a measure of how split up the fragments are. I won't get into that kind of an analysis here, but it's another way of looking at the shared DNA, whether it's all in pieces or whether you have long blocks that are shared between two people. But just from an amount of shared DNA standpoint, you'll see it's getting smaller and smaller. The relationship still could be between second to fourth cousin, but obviously the chances of someone being a closer relative are higher with a higher amount of shared centimorgans. Now, when you're out there and you're looking for matches, because that's what you're really doing with autosomal DNA testing, you're looking for people who match you close enough that you can find out how you're related and perhaps combine your genealogy in order to help you both in maybe breaking through a brick wall, understanding where the connections migrated to, who was really a sibling of whom, and so on. It'll tell you a lot more about your ancestry, hopefully, than what you already know. The matches are only as good as the databases that the companies have of people who have tested, and they don't share very much information. There is something called GEDmatch that will help you put it together, but I won't go into using that right now. It's one of the tools that you can use very effectively for autosomal DNA analysis. But if you take a look at the various companies, this is a slide that I also showed in the Y-DNA videos, because the Y-DNA side of this is much smaller. But the autosomal DNA growth in testers over the past few years is enormous. This is a chart that's produced by a website called thednageek.com. It's a very nice chart that shows how the growth of the databases is going and where the bulk of the testers are. So right now, Ancestry.com has the largest database. It's now topped over 15 million as of the end of August of this year. The second is probably 23andMe, which has just over 10 million. And if you put all these together, there's probably over 30 million testers that have put their DNA on file. Now, there's a few people that have certainly tested in several of these databases, so maybe the number's a little smaller, but you have access to millions of testers, let's say at least, that you might be able to match up with. My suggestion, and certainly I'm not alone in this, is that you should put your DNA on file in as many as you can. Certainly, you almost double your chances of finding a match if you put them into both Ancestry.com and 23andMe. But if you do the others as well, you'll have a better chance of matching someone who might have only decided to test in one single database and hasn't realized that the people that they might be matching to are in a different one. So part of this is to show that there's a lot of testers out there. There's a lot of chances to match someone. But part of this also is to encourage people to not just test with one database, but to put yourself out there in several, or to use GEDmatch so that you can analyze your relationships with other people who have tested elsewhere and have also copied their data over. But if you'll notice, that's not a very large group of people compared to those who have tested. So clearly you have some incentive to test in the databases and find the people who haven't used that kind of tool set. Now, how do you figure out your genetic matches? So you've got this test that you've done. You've got this report back that has second to fourth cousin matches. You don't know how these people are really related to you. What do you do to try to put it all together? Well, one thing, of course, is contact them, gather any information they have, see if you can bridge it. A lot of the companies' databases include surnames that you might have in common with them. They'll list all the surnames they have. But you're really looking across all of your own ancestors and all of their ancestors for common points of connection. And that's not an easy thing to do. If you know some of your relations, it becomes a little bit easier if a third match matches you on a segment that a known relative has as well. You start to be able to triangulate that these people match you on your paternal line or your maternal line, or perhaps even what ancestor you share with them, so you can start to get to your common genealogy a lot quicker. To do that, a lot of people use a technique called chromosome painting. Now, there are tools for this. There's also manual approaches. There's spreadsheets you can use. There's lots of ways to do this. But the point is, you start mapping the segments of your chromosomes that are handed down to you by certain ancestors. And sometimes you only know it's your father or your mother. Sometimes you can get more precise. But you start mapping that, and then anyone else that comes along that matches you, you can plot against this kind of chart and see which segments you have in common. That'll tell you what your common ancestors are. There's also something called the leads method, which was invented to help you cluster matches by common ancestors. It's another very powerful tool. And I'm not going into these at any level of detail. My real point here is just to tell you that there are approaches that have been developed to help you make sense out of this, but you do have to put some time in order to chart them, plot them, get help with them. That will help you then hopefully analyze your data in enough detail to tell you how people are related, and it'll help you with your genealogy. Now, as you do this, as you start to analyze your information in more detail, be aware of what I said before. Now, this is a rather busy chart, but the point of the chart is to show you that your genetic ancestry is not identical to your genealogical ancestry, because back around this 5 to 9 generation point is when you start to lose DNA. So this is a computer simulation of the ancestry that you inherit from your father and your mother. Each one is colored a different color, so there's red and blue for paternal and maternal DNA contributions. So obviously, if you're here in the middle, your father gave you half, your mother gave you half. Their parents each gave them half, so here's your grandfather and grandmother, here's the grandfather, grandmother on this side. Their parents gave them half, so father, mother here for your great-grandparents. These are all your ancestors. As you split them up and go back in time, this is a standard family tree wheel, if you will, but that's represented by colors for the different genders who passed on their DNA. As you go back, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that's about the 5th generation level. You go to 6 generations here, and you'll notice that for you, there are gaps. So this is not the DNA that they passed on to their next generation. This is the amount of DNA that you inherited from that ancestor. You didn't get any DNA at all from these ancestors here. Why? Because the pieces got so small that when the recombination happened, if you remember that crossover point in our genetics slide, that the pieces were too small and ended up getting lost, or ended up not getting passed on in the gamete, in the sex cell that ended up creating you. So that piece of DNA no longer is passed down to anyone. It may be in your sister or your brother or someone close to you. It may be in your cousin. That ancestor has not lost their DNA contributions entirely. It's just what you've personally inherited from your own ancestors. As you go back in time, the pieces of DNA get progressively smaller, as we talked about, that you end up with. But, of course, the amount of DNA that you're missing from your ancestors gets larger and larger. So this continues on back into the further ancestors, even beyond this chart, and specific ancestors will not show up in your DNA. And this is one of the reasons why the match reports stop around the 5th cousin level, because you may be related to someone after that, but you'll never know because you don't share DNA with them. So that's what this chart is intended to show. Even if they're passed on, by the way, at some level, and we can see it in this side of or this far out in the chart, the pieces of DNA get so small that when you're comparing them against random noise, it's hard to tell. You can't tell that this is a segment that you might have gotten from that ancestor. If another descendant got that piece or something else, you may never know it because the pieces are so small that they're hard to analyze. Now that was my quick overview of autosomal DNA, just the basics. Now, no one who's involved in autosomal DNA will tell you that I've done it justice, but I did want to give you at least a quick introduction to the biology behind it, the genetics behind it, and some of the ways that people approach it and how you analyze it and the things you have to think about. There are a few other things that you get out of an autosomal DNA test, though. The ethnicity reports are things that everyone talks about. So these are some of mine and some of my daughter's ethnicity reports. And I want to give you a sense of what these are. First of all, what they're based on is that, like Y-DNA, autosomal DNA has something called SNPs. They're single nucleotide polymorphisms. They're individual points in our DNA that can mutate. And some of those mutations have been identified in certain ethnic populations. And they get passed on through our DNA, through whatever ancestors we had that had those mutations. So we can identify world populations or the origins of our ancestors from world populations who carried those mutations. Now, ethnicity estimates are one of the most popular things for people to get out of their ancestry testing. People like to see what it says about where they're from. But I want to warn you about a few things that I'll go through here. So on the right-hand side, I'll talk about the comparison between my daughter and her sister's DNA tests. So I pulled these up from the system that we tested with. Now, they're both adopted from Guatemala. They both have strong Mayan influence in their ancestry. So it's not terribly surprising that they have Native Americans show up first, which is a sort of coverall for all Native American for both North, Central, and South America. Then Spain is in there. We have some African influence. We have Andean, and then we have some European, African, and other influences here. Not terribly atypical for a Central American with influences from various places with the colonizations over the years and the migrations that have happened. So again, seeing these categories is not terribly surprising. What might be surprising is that my daughter and her sister share completely different percentages, even though they're full siblings, in these various categories. So her sister, for instance, is much stronger in the Native American Andean category. My daughter is much stronger in her Native American North, Central, and South category. Does that mean anything? Not really. The point is that they inherited slightly different DNA. That slightly different DNA carries with it slightly different DNA mutations. And though their basic ethnic makeup looks similar, the percentages they get are very different. So be aware that your percentages won't match any of your relatives precisely. It's not that precise for one thing, and the difference in DNA that you inherited is going to sway it one way or the other. The other thing, then I'll show you some of mine over here on the left, is this is still an ethnicity estimate. It is not precise. It's not the exact amount of DNA that you inherited. And every company's database has a slightly different set of reference points that it uses to come up with this information. So for instance, from one company, I get that I'm 94.5% Northwestern European. It breaks it down into nearly half French and German, with a strong sense of British and Irish in here. Scandinavian is up there. Something called broadly Northwestern European, sounds like a catch-all, is nearly 20%. And then I have some Southern European, Spanish and Portuguese, tiny bit of Ashkenazi Jewish for some reason, and then the rest is another catch-all of broadly European. If I test with a different company, instead of 26.7%, the British Isles, basically, I get only 7% here. I get 97% European, but most of it falls into a broad category called West and Central Europe. I suppose that might equate to French and German, perhaps, but the rest of these percentages are lost. The third company I've tested with puts me 52% in England, Wales, and Northwestern Europe category, with 35% Germanic Europe, basically Germany, has a 9% Ireland and Scotland, 2% Sweden, 2% Norway, I guess that translates to my 4% Scandinavian, less than 1% European Jewish. So these percentages are not only completely different categories, but slightly different percentages. I can't map my 7% from the British Isles here to anything that I got from the other companies. I can sort of translate some of this to some of the ones that I got, but the reference points are all different, so I don't know whether or not these really match up to my exact heritage. By the way, if I plot my family tree and I look back I can go back to most of my 4 generations back, 5 generations back. I start to lose a lot of ancestors around 6 or 7 generations, but I can look back to all of the ones that immigrated from Europe, at least, which is most of what this ethnicity says I'm from. I get a different percentage if I look at those ancestors by the countries they came from. This will not match exactly to what I think my ancestry is. It's just an estimate. So when you get your own, look at it, absorb it, see what it tells you. It may reveal some surprises, but in general, it's too vague, it's too broad to really show you that you have complete surprises in your ancestry. It may reveal some, but it usually doesn't. The other thing which people often take autosomal DNA tests for is for health reports. Now, these are often provided by 23andMe as part of your tests, not often provided by the other companies, but there are third-party sites that you can go to and get these reports as well. So these are just a couple of mine from different places. I want to be clear that these are predispositions, not disease reports. It doesn't say you're going to get certain things. I like this one over here on the right because it says I have a particular DNA mutation that puts me at 7 times risk of male baldness. This is not an actual picture of me. My hair is thinning, but it doesn't look like this. Most of these will give you a predisposition report. You may have some of the conditions, you may not. You may never get them. So be a little careful. Don't immediately get scared by a report that says you have a higher predisposition for something bad, because it may or may not happen to you. A lot of people go through life with a predisposition to something and never see it happen. The other thing which you'll get is you may get some variants that are detected, like this one here for age-related macular degeneration, but not likely at increased risk. So hard to tell what that means. So you need to do a lot more work on these to figure out what they really mean to you. But again, those are informational, not diagnosis. That doesn't say that there are not concerns that people worry about that are real. I've listed some of the concerns here. I'm not going to go through them all, but certainly there are things about putting DNA all into one database and getting millions of people's DNA information on file that brings up concerns for people. These are real. My opinion on this is it doesn't bother me as much. Most of these don't bother me as much, but you need to be comfortable that your concerns have been met when you go into this field, and that your concerns are met as you continue to analyze your DNA. Not all of these, I think, are real today. A lot of them are potential. Even the current concerns, things like insurance use of your DNA information, is not upon us yet. It is a potential that people are concerned about, but we don't have that happening today. We do have law enforcement accessing some DNA databases in order to find criminals. That also bothers people from a privacy standpoint. Again, there's a lot of media attention on this type of thing. You'll see a lot of legal discussions about it in future as people seek to protect themselves and others for their DNA being on file. Just be aware that it is a part of genetic genealogy that we all talk about from time to time. There's lots of informed opinions, and my advice really translates to be informed. If you're going to be in this field, these are important things to a lot of people. Just be aware that it's important to a lot of people, and be aware of the things that are important to you. The last thing that I'll leave you with is some ideas from it for additional resources. There are 2 books that I particularly like. The Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy by Blaine Bettinger is a very good introduction to the field, autosomal DNA, as well as some information about Y-DNA as well. There's a little more advanced techniques described in the second book, Advanced Genetic Genealogy Techniques and Case Studies, which is by Debbie Parker Wayne and others. So there's been a lot of contributors to that particular book. And it's a good set of more advanced approaches to your DNA analysis. On the right-hand side, we've got some online resources, some social media, both Facebook. There's a genetic genealogy tips and techniques where you'll hit a lot of the experts and get good advice there. There's several thousand people actually who are in that Facebook group. Then you've got on Yahoo Groups, if Facebook isn't for you, there's a DNA newbie forum that gets a lot of traffic as well for people who are just starting out. And then a few more online resources. There's a good video series called the DNA Lecture Series at that YouTube channel that has some very good videos on DNA, both autosomal and Y-DNA. And then I have some resources also listed in the Some Useful Links section of my surname project results page, and you can go to that link to find those. I hope that was useful to you. I hope that gave you at least a taste of what you can do with autosomal DNA. Please explore these additional resources and others that you can find in order to help learn, and I hope you get a lot of use out of your tests. Thank you for listening.